Hello everybody on the interwebs, this is Doc Eon coming to you with another review. This time I am reviewing 13th Age, a fantasy role-playing game by Rob Hansu and Jonathan Tweet from Pelgrane Press, published by Pelgrane Press. And first off, this thing, me showing my face, this is new for the channel. I haven't had the setup to do that before, the equipment to do it, and also I'm a bit shy. But I thought it might be a little bit more engaging if I mix up the filming style. Don't worry, when I talk about the actual details of the rules and so forth, I will be showing you this on a table and filming the book directly the way I usually do. But I wanted to give an introduction, and also the conclusion will be in this style. So let me know how you think that works out, if I should continue doing this going forward, if there's anything I need to tweak with the lighting, the sound. I'm experimenting with having this mic here, so we'll see how it goes. Anyway, enough preamble about technology. My one-line review of it is, this is my favorite version of Dungeons and Dragons ever. I would say it's the best D&D. But that comes with qualifications, because D&D can be many different things to different people. So I have to explain what I mean by that, and that is what most of the review will consist of. By hopefully, when I show you the rules and the mechanics of it, and I explain why I think they're good, that will explain what I think is good, and you can see if you agree with me or not. Now, when I say it's the best version of D&D, I say that as somebody who has played a lot of D&D. I have played just about every version of D&D officially published. Not OD&D, not the very first version from the 70s, but from the Tom Moldvay basic set and first edition AD&D onwards, I have played and DM'd some of every edition, some more than others. And specifically, I can say that the last three, third, fourth, and fifth, I have been a player or a DM in at least a couple of campaigns per edition, and the same for this game, for 13th Age. So when I say these things, I have some basis for comparison. I hope I can, that shows that I know a little bit what I'm talking about. Now, who else knows what they're talking about? Well, the writers of this game. If you recognize the names, well, Jonathan Tweet has designed a lot of games, but he was, for these purposes, the most relevant thing is that he was the lead designer on the team that made 3rd edition D&D. Rob Hansu was one of the lead designers on the team that made 4th edition D&D. And the story about how 13th Age came about is that these two men were friends. They had both left Wizards of the Coast, and they were having just an informal conversation about, what would we have done with D&D without corporate oversight? If we hadn't had the bean counters telling us what was marketable, what needed to be done, what would we have done? And they decided to make that game, and this is the result. So that's a little bit about what this is, the background of me and the people involved in talking about it. Why now is the next question. Why am I reviewing this now? Because this game came out in 2013. It's an old ass game, and in fact it's being replaced next year. I'm filming this in 2024, and late 2025, I think August 2025 is when the 2nd edition is supposed to be published. It was recently kickstarted. I backed it, of course. So why am I talking about 1st edition 13th Age now? Well, I thought somebody needed to toss this hat into the ring, because there's a lot of discourse online right now about alternatives to D&D. The contenders, the new contenders to D&D's crown, so to speak, that came up after all the debacles, all the scandals that Wizards of the Coast have been involved in, and Hasbro. And nobody seems to mention 13th Age, probably because it's been around for a long while. It's not new, so it's not Daggerheart or the MTDM game or DC-20 or Tales of the Valiant. It's just something that's been around for a decade by now. So maybe people aren't giving it a look. But and of course, the hyperbole of replacing D&D. That's never going to happen because D&D has market dominance. Nothing will ever change that. We can just put that out aside for the moment. That there is no D&D killer. But if you are a discerning gamer, if you are somebody who wants to make a decision, a considered decision about what game to play and think for yourself, if you're one of the few who can do that, I think you should, if you have been considering alternatives to D&D, playing other games, you should be giving 13th Age a shot. And this review will hopefully help you convince you why. Now I'm going to go to the table and have a look at all the contents. So in general, I'm of the opinion that starting your role-playing core book with a huge setting chapter is a bad idea. Some games like to do that because they think the setting's the selling point of the game, or they start with some fiction because they think that is cool. I'm generally against all that. This game kind of does that, but not really, and I'll explain why that's good. It starts with a short piece of setting. It starts with just a few pages about the icons, who are important NPCs in the implied setting of the game. But most of the setting information is saved for the back of the book. And why is this information the first thing you get? Well, because this is actually useful. You have to know these things when you generate your character. It's because you have mechanics like the icon relationships that everybody has. You need to know who the icons are before you can say what your relationship to them is. And also some of the classes, even, like particularly the sorcerer, have some powers that actually reference the icons. So you should know a little bit about them. So these are the 13 icons of the 13th Age. It's explained later that this setting goes through ages marked by catastrophe and sort of civilization resets, and the usual apocalyptic fantasy stuff. But the icons are the most important NPCs, the movers and shakers of the world, the leaders of the big factions that exist in the world. They struggle for power, and your characters need to be sort of aligned with or against them. Now, they are very archetypical, you might say stereotypical. They have names, just have titles like the Archmage or the Elf Queen or the Priestess or the High Druid. And you just have one page about each here. So it's very short and to the point and very basic information that you need. And like I said, you need this information later, and it helps to sort of set the tone as to what kind of fantasy world this is a little bit before you start making your character. So that's good. The character creation section starts with a basic checklist, and it has some things like choosing your race, your class, how you make your stats, blah, 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 your defenses, hit points, whatever. This is not unusual. This is just stuff you have in every game. The unique things start with this, your one unique thing. Because every character in this game needs to have something that sets them apart from everybody else, and it is called out specifically. This cannot be a combat power. It cannot actually be a power of any kind that's just a tool that you use to get around encounters. It's a story hook. It's something about how your character ties into the world in a way that no other character does. And what it's supposed to do is provide the GM, I should say, in this game, with ideas about, it's like a flag that the player sends up showing what sort of things they would be interested in happening. But you have to explain that, of course. And so this is more of a story game mechanic. Most of this is a very traditional gaming system, but it has some story gaming roots. Then we get to the icon relationships, and you have to allot a certain amount of points to relationships with the icons. They can be positive, negative, or conflicted relationships. There is a division of the icons into heroic, ambiguous, and villainous, but this is just the sort of standard array. This is the suggested way to divide them up. You can do that. You can say anybody's a hero or a villain in your campaign, and a lot of people, the players in my campaigns have tended, and I've realized by reading online that they're not alone in saying that we don't care for the Emperor, even though he's supposed to be a heroic icon. Is you know, fight the power, man. There is some indication of how to use these relationships here. We'll come back to the full rules later, so talk more about that later, as I said. Next, we have backgrounds and skill checks. Now, what are backgrounds? Well, you assign a certain number of points to various backgrounds, and backgrounds are essentially free-floating skills. It's like you say you have a background in, for example, I used to be a pirate, and I'll put a +2 in that. That means you will get a +2 to any roll, any skill roll, which are usually based on an ability score, an attribute. I forget what they're called in this game. A characteristic, a stat. But then you get to add any relevant backgrounds as well. So, well, anything having to do with being on a sailing ship, you should get your pirate bonus to that. Anything having to do with buying or selling contraband in a port town, your pirate background should help you with that. For example, anything you can convince the GM to let you get away with, you should get your background bonus to. And they give some examples of how you can specify a background. And I like this because it frees you up. It doesn't the skill system in having a skill system in a game that isn't skill based. And D&D is not skill based. Skills are tacked on to the core system of D&D. And it always feels kind of intrusive and kind of clumsy and kind of, well, why can't I get better at this? Why do I have to, if I want to prove a skill, I have to put put a feat into that, which takes away from my ASIs. Yeah, I'm talking about 5th ed here. It's all very clumsy and unintuitive and gets in your way a lot. And I like the way 13th Age does it much better, I have to say. Now, then we come to feats. Most feats are described in the class chapters because most feats are connected to your class abilities. Feats in this game are, compared to D&D 5e, smaller in scope, but you get more of them. Specifically, you get 1 each level. And what they usually do is just they enhance things you're already good at. They don't give you completely new things to do, because your class gives you enough of those. Now, there are some general feats here you can take if you want, for example, to always get the drop on people. You can take improved initiative, but that's a boring feat. Don't do that. There's a listing of all the feats. I'm not really sure why it's here. You just tend to look in your class chapter anyway. We get to gear. Gear is supremely unimportant in this game. There are a few pages with price lists for items, but this is never talked about again. In fact, when you get to the treasure section in the back, there are options for like doing a campaign without talking about money at all. It's not a game where gathering up gold coins is important, because there's nothing you can do with them. And you might have noticed if you played 5e D&D, after the first few levels you can't do anything useful with your gold either. So it's kind of pointless. The only real thing you can do in this game with gold is buy potions and other expendable magic items. And so there's an option in the treasure section for just handing out those instead of gold. But of course, there's some... You can give players the freedom to buy the potions they want if you give them the gold. Anyway, these items... The idea of this game is that the heroes are adventurers. They are prepared. If they're going into a situation where they're going to need rope, they're going to have some rope on them. If they're going into dark places, they're going to have some torches. Don't sweat the small stuff. Don't like this tracking of how many arrows you have or how many rations of food you have. Is that fun? Is that interesting? Is that part of heroic fiction or Swords and Sorcery? No, it's not. Nobody ever does that. That is an artifact. That's a remnant of the roots of D&D as a war game. And, you know, in the kind of stories you want to tell with a game like this, it's not important. As for races, now races are not going to be called that. I think they're changing the name of that in 2nd edition, like in all modern games. I forgot what it was they're going to change it to. Doesn't matter. Anyway, we have the classical races mostly, and compared to other D&D versions, they've been vastly simplified. Each race gets a choice, usually of two different. They can improve one of two ability scores. So, for example, for half orcs, either strength or dexterity, and they get a racial power. That's it. There is some fluff text here, but mostly the fluff is whatever you want it to be. They don't see any need to spend reams of text just explaining what an elf or a dwarf is or supposed to be in this setting, because it's up to you and your players. If a player wants to be, because it limits the creativity of your players if you provide these like culturally homogeneous descriptions of what all halflings are like. It's just in the way. And the reason for doing ability bonuses, I've got to check, what are they called? Ability scores, right. So, and by the way, one of the only missteps of this game that I feel they could have improved upon even more is they still have this idea of ability scores that are on the originally 3 to 18 scale, and then you convert that into a modifier, instead of just having the modifier as the score, which is the more fast and logical way to do it. And I don't think they're changing that in 2nd edition either, unfortunately. But anyway, they wanted to get away from the min-maxing of choosing your race based on which class you want to play, because each class also gives you a choice of one of two different, usually, ability scores that you can improve by +2, and you cannot stack them. You cannot have the same from your race and your class. So the idea is that this will make it viable to play, say, a wizard of any race, because you don't need to get one that has an intelligence bonus. You get your intelligence bonus from the class. And it turns out that there is still a little bit of min-maxing you can do. For example, if you want to be a fighter, those get a bonus from the class to either strength or con, and you'll take one, and maybe you want the other as well, so you will look for a race that has either strength or con, so you can get that. Maybe that could happen. Also, the Wood Elves' racial power is amazingly OP, so that's getting nerfed in 2nd edition. Yeah, but I like the simplification of the races, because nobody cares about all that nonsense and all the little things like who has dark vision and who blah blah blah. There is no dark vision in this game, I approve. It's not important. It's a silly thing. It just gets in the way of play, and all these other little tiny bonuses to this or that. It's who needs to keep track of those penny ante details. So I like their approach to races in this game. 4 classes. We have 9 classic classes in the core rules,
Barbarian, Ranger, Paladin, Fighter, Cleric, Sorcerer, Rogue, Bard, Wizard. You'll note that of the 12 in D&D 5e, Druid, Monk, and Warlock are missing. Druid and Monk show up in the first supplement, 13 True Ways. Warlock never shows up. There are classes in supplements for this game called Demonologist and Necromancer, who are kind of fill the role of the sort of, if you will, evil spellcaster, but no Warlock. And I don't think they've ever said publicly why, but I think I can understand why. Because I don't like Warlocks either. There is no design space for them. The Warlocks, in the way they've worked, always worked in D&D ever since 3rd edition, mostly I've seen them in 4th and 5th. What's their unique selling point? They're just magical gunslingers who, like one-trick ponies. How is that connected to their fluff of having a pact with some being? I don't get it, and none of it tracks. It's Warlock is a really weird class. Anyway, what we do have is they have an idea of which classes are easier to play, because while they have kept the idea from 4th edition D&D of every class should have interesting powers or abilities, none of them should just be swinging a sword and making basic attacks all the time, they don't all have exactly the same mechanics. That's one of the complaints people had about 4E, is that every class felt the same because every class had the same number of at-will, encounter, and daily powers. And they sort of, if you ignore the details, that they might look very similar. In this game, they have made it so each class has its own unique mechanics. There are still these classifications that some abilities can be used all the time, some can be used once per battle, and some can be used once per day, and some are somewhere in between. But it's not consistently the same number of each for each class, and some classes have abilities that work in very different ways. Like, for instance, the fighter that has abilities that key off what you rolled on your attack die. There's only 10 levels, but each level is packed with stuff you get. You get something new, interesting stuff every level. There are no dead levels like in D&D. And you get choices all the time, because every time you get, for example, we have a bard here. Every level you get a feat, and that's a choice. You get, for example, here, you get new battle cries, spells, and songs, and you choose those from lists. It's not just the spellcasting classes like in D&D, even the martial classes. Let's see if we can find a martial class. Now, cleric is definitely not martial. Let's go on to something like the fighter. The fighter has maneuvers, it has talents. It doesn't get that many new talents, but you can choose these things, and you can, especially by choosing the feats, you can see here you have the basic abilities and the talents. The talent system, just about every class has 3 talents to start out with, and some can gain more, some do not. Talents are kind of, they're sort of in between. If I'm comparing it to D&D 5e again, somewhere in between a feat and a class ability, or maybe a subclass ability, because there are no subclasses in this game. You make your own subclass by which talents and other abilities you choose. Like, the talents possible talents for a fighter are things like you can make an archer fighter, or you can make a heavy warrior, or they go on to the other side. Yeah, you can make a really tough warrior, or one who's good at intercepting. You mix and match, and you sort of choose what your fighter is going to be good at. And you might also have noticed from this table that the math is a little different from some D&D editions. that you gain quite a lot of hit points, and the monsters do as well when you level up, but you also gain a lot more damage output because martial class, everybody who has uses weapons, they have a certain damage die for the weapon. For example, a one-handed melee heavy martial weapon for a fighter might be a longsword or a warhammer. It's called, so it has 1d8. That's at first level. You multiply this by your level. So at second level, you do 2d8 with that sword. At third level, 3d8, and so on and so forth. So every class becomes more dangerous as you level up. But the thing I want to emphasize is how much choice you get, because this is what's missing from many versions of D&D, specifically 5e. Absolutely sucks as far as choice goes. You have no meaningful choices after you've chosen your subclass. Here, you do. Now, one of the things being addressed in 2nd edition is that some choices over the years, people have played this game, they've figured out maybe some choices are more optimal than others. So they want to rebalance that in the new edition, and specifically buff abilities and powers that were not chosen so often to make them more attractive and to make them viable. And I applaud that decision. But, I still think 1st edition is very playable as it is, and that does provide a lot of choice. You can make a lot of different builds with the characters. And yeah, that's the most important thing with the classes. Combat is what most of this game will come down to. Most of the rules are actually about fighting. All of the class powers and so forth, there's very little non-combat stuff there, because the idea is that non-combat stuff, like exploration of social encounters, you handle that through conversation and role-playing. You don't actually need much in the way of rules for it. It can be fun and interesting and important, but it's not the mechanical meat of the game. Now, most of the combat rules are not something we need to spend a lot of time on. As far as missed opportunities, they have a very standard initiative system where you just roll your dexterity modifier plus your level, and you have an order, and you go down the list, and everybody takes their turn. There's more interesting design alternatives out there today, but it's not bad. It's just very, very standard. Like I said, a cyclic initiative. The interesting additions they've made are things like the escalation die. Now, what is this? The idea is that player characters should always start every combat encounter on the back foot, because the monsters are designed to be just a bit more dangerous than they are. However, the idea is that as the combat goes on, the player characters will gain the upper hand, and the escalation die is the mechanic for that. It functions like this. At the beginning of the second round of combat, you put a d6, hopefully one that stands out from the rest, in the middle of the table with the 1 showing. And all player characters get a +1 to all attack rolls that they make during that round. And that increases every round until you hit +6, and that's the maximum. Usually only PCs get this. A very few monsters might be able to get it. Specifically, dragons are scary enough that they also get the bonus, so they're always scary. There's class abilities and powers that key off the escalation die. Some can only be used when the escalation die is at certain values. There are mechanics where certain powers or monsters can change the value, like de-escalate, or as they say, hijack the escalation die, and that's scary. But generally the idea is that combat should feel dangerous when it starts, but it should be over relatively quickly. And you do this by giving the players this escalating bonus, so you don't wind up in a situation where several rounds go by and people just whiff. And that is a very good thing. Another interesting mechanic is the fleeing mechanic. The rule for fleeing is simply, well, if all the players agree that this combat is going down the drain, we can't win it, they'll just turn to the GM and say, we flee. And that is automatically successful. You always get away. Not scot-free. You get away from the immediate situation scot-free, but what happens is you have to take what's called a campaign loss. That is, the GM will say that something you wanted to accomplish in campaign terms, in narrative terms, now becomes closed off because you lost time fleeing. And this mechanic comes up in another way later as well. And I think, again, this is brilliant. This is a beautiful idea, and I really like it. Also, a lot of attacks do damage even when they miss. This is another way of not slowing combat down, not feeling bad because you whiffed. You usually do something when you use your character abilities. Death and dying, not much to say there. The last thing I think I want to talk about in the combat chapter, well, apart from this good piece of advice, don't sweat modifiers. We don't want to do a lot of math, is the advice about resting, recharging, and heal-ups. So in D&D, there is this consistent problem of the 15-minute adventuring day, where people want to take rests all the time. Specifically in 5e, there are some classes that get recharged their abilities on a short rest, so they want to take short rests, and they want to stop for an hour, like in the middle of a dungeon or something. And others need a long rest, and so when somebody's low on hit points, they're going to say, oh, we want to go to sleep. And it can be really hard to manage that. It can be very annoying. So this game, what does it do? Well, first off, there's only two types of rest. There's the quick rest and the full heal up. The quick rest, characters are assumed to take a quick rest after every combat, and it's very quick. It's like, and not, it's like a few minutes. It's not defined a specific amount of time, and you can do the sort of things you would do on a short rest in D&D. The full heal up is what it sounds like. It recharges everything, but players don't get to choose. The GM says when you get a full heal up. And the general system suggested is they should get a full heal up after 4 normal strength combat encounters, or more often if you throw harder encounters at them. So it is purely based on the expected usage of resources like hit points and once per day abilities. The day is not a literal day. The day in daily abilities is the time between 2 full heal ups. This was confusing apparently to some people, because I know that in 2nd edition they're changing the terminology of days to something else. I think arcs, which I'm not sure about that specific word, but it's probably good to take the day terminology out. And so this makes healing up not a diegetic thing. You can, like, diegetically, as in the story, say you go to bed and rest, you still don't get a full heal up until the GM says you get one. And I can see some players might get a little bit annoyed at that, but I think the advantages of this system far outweigh the disadvantages. And, you know, I've actually never had a player complain about it. So, because what it does is it, but I should add, the players can, if they really want to, force a full heal up. But then they take a campaign loss. They can at any time say, no, screw you, GM, we're taking a full rest now, a full heal up. And the GM says, okay, but this counts. This is sort of the same as fleeing, is that you're wasting time. And that means the campaign world goes on without you, and something happens. Like the villagers you were trying to rescue, they're sacrificed to the blood god. So some goal you were trying to accomplish gets closed off. So there's always an ability to get what you want, but it has consequences. It has costs. And I like that too. The chapter on running the game starts out with using icon relationships. Now, the icon relationship mechanic was perhaps the newest thing in this game when it came out. And there are some suggestions for how you should use it in this core book. Specifically, the idea they put forth is that you should start each session with rolling for icon relationships, and those relationships that turn up results, specifically you roll a d6 for each. On a 6 or a 5 something happens. A 6 you get an advantage, a 5 you get an advantage with a complication. And then the GM should look at all the results from the players' rolls and work that into the session. Essentially, what the idea of a typical game session they're envisioning is that it's improved mostly by the GM based on the icon relationship roles. And they do recognize that not every GM is as good at thinking on their feet as they are. So they include some options like, okay, you could roll at the end of a session and let the GM plan the next session based on that, so they have some more time. But it kind of starts to fall apart if you have a more linear campaign. If you have like a published adventure, or if you want to have a certain story that you're sort of following and not go off the rails completely. So what happened during the life of this game is that in various supplements and adventures, there were put forward different ways of using the icon relationship dice. And I'm not going to go over all of them, but I find it interesting that, like I mentioned, in adventures, like some adventure designers on their own came up with different ideas of using the icon relationships in their scenario that weren't published anywhere else. So there was a lot of creativity here. And from what I understand, second edition is going to try to give more assistance here, give more versions, more variety in methods to use these icon relationships, and put them officially in the core book, which I feel is a good idea. The other big thing I want to point out in this chapter is the building battles. Now, this is a small chart here, which shows basically the idea is the number of sort of encounter points should be equal to the number of characters. Like if you have 5 character group, a normal encounter is 5 points. So what would that, or 5 levels of monster rather. And this shows you that for an adventure, so the levels are divided into 3 tiers called Adventurer, Champion, and Epic. If you're an Adventurer tier, one level is a same level monster counts as 1 point, as 1. A mook counts as 0.2, a large counts as 2, and a huge monster counts as 3. And so you build your encounters this way. And the idea, as you can see, is that when you're higher level, higher tier, you can handle tougher monsters. And the amazing thing is, this chart, as simple as it is, actually works. Unlike the CR system in D&D 5e, this seems to have been playtested, or it seems like they've actually worked out the math in advance. Because it works. I've designed lots and lots of successful encounters just using this simple chart. And it's fascinating how good game design can make your life easier as a GM. And I really like that. Of course, they also note that you can sometimes have unfair encounters, and I like that too. Now, one thing I didn't mention, I said that when levels, something good happens at every level. You might wonder, if there's only 10 levels, aren't campaigns rather short? Well, there is the option of having what they call the 10-session campaign, where you level up after every session. But otherwise, you might wonder, how often should you level up? And there's some advice here for how often that should happen. The advice is perhaps a little on the... the idea is the basic advice is one level every 3 or 4 full heal ups, which means 12 to 16 normal battles. That's a long time to wait for a level up. Can be a lot of sessions in my experience. So they do note that you can speed that up or slow down as you like. But this rule is the really important thing, the incremental advance rule. What it does is it gives the player characters some sort of reward at the end of every session. Every session that you don't get to level up, you instead get an incremental advance. And what is that? Well, it means you get to pick one thing from the next level in advance. You get to try out a power from the next level, for example, before you're actually supposed to get it. And there are some limitations to what you can take. You can, for example, not take increased damage. The extra weapon die, that's not the thing you can get in advance. You have to wait for the actual level to get that. But almost everything else can be taken as an incremental advance. And that means something happens after every session of play. And that just feels good. And I really like that. And over here's the loot idea that I mentioned before, that they even have an optional no math system where you just roll for getting potions. And there is, if you want to use gold as a currency, there is guidance for how much to give out per level or even per full heal up. But gold is not very important, like I said. The monster section includes rules for mooks, which are kind of like, minions or extras in other games. Simple monsters that can die by the droves to big heroes. And there's some rules here. They're subdivided by which icon they're more connected to instead of purely alphabetically. So that's kind of interesting. The thing I want to highlight about monster design in this game is they have very short stat blocks. I have not seen one bigger than 1 column. I think that's probably the most complicated, is like a vampire or something. Has a whole... Well, the trolls and the vampires have pretty much a whole column for themselves. But otherwise, most stat blocks are like a couple of paragraphs. And if you were to just take out the fluff text at the beginning here, it would be even shorter. And they do this by taking away all the unnecessary crap. You don't need to have stat bonuses or saving throws or skill bonuses. None of that's important for a monster. You need the things you have here. You have the classification, you have initiative score, you have attacks and other powers, and you have the defenses and the hit points. And there's 3 defenses here. There's AC, PD, physical defense, and magical defense, which, well, physical defense is like anything that in D&D would be a constitution or dexterity or strength saving throw. Mental defense is anything that would be a saving throw against one of the other 3 stats. And so that's one thing, the simplicity of it. The other is that each monster, even the lowliest of them, even a simple goblin, has something interesting going on. Like, we have the goblin grunt here. They don't have much of special abilities. They have the Shifty Bugger ability to get a +5 bonus to disengage checks. But their basic attack, physical attack, is it does more damage if the goblins outnumber their foes than if they don't. So there's a small little rider there. And most monsters are a little bit more complicated than that. But mostly it's stuff that makes things simple for the GM, in that usually I as a GM don't even have to choose. I don't have to look at a list of powers and, oh god, what's this monster going to do this round. I can just, most things they do key off die rolls or riders to whether they succeed or fail with their main ability. It's mostly automated for me. And I appreciate that so much as the GM. Not having to look through long spell lists to decide what's this big boss going to do. Oh, it's kind of decided for me, either decided for me or it's decided by the dice. It's kind of like if you've seen a game from Freely called Forbidden Lands or the new Dragonbane, where they have the D6 tables for random monster attacks. It's a little like that. It's the same basic idea. It's not exactly the same in practice, of course, but the basic idea of giving monsters interesting things to do while taking pressure off the GM to come up with those interesting things to do. And I just love mechanics like that because I'm a forever GM. I'm usually the GM, so thinking up interesting monster tactics is not having to think up all these things myself for the monsters takes a great deal of work off my shoulders. And yeah, that is why I believe monster design is much better here. So in essence, it follows up on the best parts of D&D 4e's monster design and hones it even more, makes it even simpler and more effective to use. And it's so much better than 5e. Gosh. The Dragon Empire is the assumed setting of the game, but it doesn't make a lot of assumptions. Like it says here, the map is not complete. There is a basic map of where it seems to be taking place, but when you get down to it, every single spot that has a name on this map is just given a very short description of approximately what it is. And a lot of them provide options. A lot of them all of them explicitly leave a lot of stuff open for you to define yourself. It's just a sketch of a background. It's deliberately left very open so that your world will vary, depending a lot on what the one unique things your players chose were and what icon relationships they chose. You can choose to focus on different parts of this world and develop them further. Now, some of them have gotten whole supplements that show you how to do this. There is, for example, a book about this City of Monsters, Drakenhall, and it's a whole book just about different visions of different versions, how you can use this place in different ways in your campaign. And again, I appreciate this gives me some guidance about what to do, about what the world is like, but it doesn't tie me down to several thick books full of lore, right, that I have to memorize and that it has to be a certain way. And again, this is a middle ground, providing some structure, but also a lot of freedom. And most of this game is that way. And the final section I want to talk about is magic items. Now, magic items, apart from potions and other consumables, magic items, there are no just +1 or +2 items in this game. All the items have interesting powers, all of them do something special, and all of them have a quirk. They have personalities of their own, and they try to affect the personalities of their wearer. And the basic rule is, as long as you don't have more true magic items on you than your level, you're fine. But if you put on more magic items than that, they start to take over. And what the rules say is that if you have more magic items than your level, you have to roleplay all the quirks. And that can get really interesting. I found that players, as a rule, kind of enjoy role-playing these quirks even if they don't have to, and they will pick up on at least some of them and just play them out anyway, because it's fun. Now there are some limitations, like you can only have one in each sort of slot. They're called chakras here, for whatever reason. And there are also ideas for how you can sort of how you can sometimes have a magic item that sort of levels up with you and grows with you. If you don't want to discard your old sword, it can, when you get to the next tier, it can get the next tier of powers. That is not made into a general rule here. I get the sense they want to make that more of a general rule in second edition, because it seems like it's a thing a lot of people wanted to do. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not part of the second edition playtest, so I haven't followed along exactly what's going to happen. But again, they want to make magic items special and not just generic, and I think they managed that. And one of the ways to manage that is, of course, you don't have tables to roll on for random items. You as the GM have to decide, or the adventure designer who writes an adventure has to decide what items they specifically place there. Or there is the method suggested of players having wish lists, and you can sort of pick stuff off that. And with that, well, there's a beginning scenario that ends the book, and some appendices with tables and stuff. But in general, that's it. Let's go to my conclusion.
So, to conclude this review of 13th Age, why do I think it's good? Well, because it's the best at what it does, and it does not do everything. It has chosen a focus. Where a game like D&D 5e tries to be all things to all people, 13th Age doesn't do that. It has decided to focus on certain aspects of the D&D fantasy, and I feel it hones those almost to perfection. Hopefully the second edition will be even more perfect. And if you agree with me that things like resource management just aren't any fun, maybe you will agree with me that 13th Age is a great game. It doesn't so much do dungeon crawls or hex crawls. It doesn't crawl, it runs. That's my conclusion. And so I feel 13th Age is an amazing game. It's not for every genre of fantasy, but for the style of campaign that it is written for, it's superb. And that finishes my review this time around. So thank you for watching. Please give this review a thumbs up if you felt it enlightening. Please comment below what you thought. If there's anything I missed explaining that you want more explanation of about the game, any comments about this style of doing reviews, and complaints about technical things, it's fine. I can manage it. Just put them below in the comments. And for now, I'm signing off.